March 14th, 1945. Baltimore City Hospital, Pediatric Ward. Doctor. Evelyn Hargrove held the medical chart for 3-year-old Tommy Whitaker and felt something she hadn't experienced in her 9 years of medical practice. A creeping sensation that had nothing to do with the March wind rattling the hospital windows. This was the 19th chart. 19 children. 19 case histories with eerily similar presentations. Sudden poisonings of unknown origin, unexplained seizures, bizarre allergic reactions to foods these children had eaten their entire lives without incident. And in every single chart, under underscore underscore quote underscore 0 underscore underscore, the same name appeared. Mrs. Constance Pruitt. Kind Connie. The beloved grandmother of the entire Locust Point neighborhood. The woman mothers trusted with their children as much as they trusted themselves. And she was always there when a child took ill. Always the first to call for help. Always weeping over the small body clutched in her arms. Always saving them. But what if they needed saving from her? Evelyn stared at the stack of charts on her desk. 19 children over 11 years, 2 of them dead. The rest survived, but several were permanently disabled. Officially, this was a series of unfortunate accidents. Unofficially, this was something so horrifying that American medicine barely had terminology for it. Evelyn pulled out a fresh notepad and began constructing a timeline. She didn't yet know she was beginning a hunt for a monster hiding behind the mask of a caring old woman. A monster who fed on children's suffering like a vampire feeds on blood. And that the path to truth would take 18 months of painstaking work, sleepless nights, and battling a system that refused to believe the obvious. To understand how it all began, we need to go back 11 years, to the day when Constance Pruitt first walked through the doors of the neighborhood clinic with someone else's child in her arms, and heard the words that changed her forever. July 1934. Baltimore sweltered under a brutal summer heat wave. The Depression still gripped the nation, and relief was hard to come by. Asphalt softened into sticky tar. Air shimmered above the row houses, and even the trees in the small neighborhood yard stood motionless, as if exhausted. Constance Pruitt sat on the stoop outside her row house and watched the neighbor children race around, shrieking, laughing, living. She was 45 years old. She was childless. Her husband Walter worked long hours at the Bethlehem Steel shipyard, coming home exhausted and silent. They'd been married 19 years and never had children. At first, they'd sought medical help, traveled to specialists, held on to hope. Then, they accepted it. Walter said they had each other, and that was enough. But it wasn't enough for Constance. She needed children. Not children in the abstract, not other people's children generally, but her own. Ones who would run to her crying, "Mama," who would embrace her, who would need her. The emptiness had become unbearable over the years. The house felt hollow. The silence pressed against her ears like water. Constance started spending time on the stoop, sitting outside, watching the children play. Sometimes she brought penny candy and distributed it to the little ones. Sometimes she helped tie shoes or wipe noses. Mothers nodded gratefully to her as they rushed to factory jobs or relief lines. "Mrs. Pruitt, could you keep an eye on Bobby for just a minute?" "Mrs. Pruitt, would it be all right if I left Susie with you for an hour?" And Constance agreed. Of course, gladly. She never asked for money. She didn't need money. What she needed was attention. She needed gratitude. She needed to be needed. That sweltering July day, she sat on the stoop watching 4-year-old Jimmy Doyle attempt to climb the fire escape ladder. His mother, Dorothy, worked at a canning factory and left her son with his grandmother during the day. A grandmother who, frankly, drank more than she supervised. Jimmy was dirty, barefoot, his knees covered in scrapes. Constance watched him and felt that familiar aching sensation. She wanted to take him, clean him up, feed him, comfort him. She wanted him to call her Mama. Suddenly, Jimmy lost his grip and fell. The impact was substantial. The boy screamed, clutching his arm. Constance leaped up and rushed to him. She scooped him up and held him close. Jimmy sobbed into her shoulder while she stroked his hair and whispered, quotes 4. The arm was swelling visibly. Broken. Constance knew she needed to get the child to the emergency clinic. She gathered Jimmy into her arms and carried him. He was heavy, but she didn't feel the weight. She only felt the warmth of the small body pressed against her chest. He needed her. He trusted her. He clung to her with his good arm. At the emergency clinic, the attending physician, a young woman with tired eyes, set the bone and applied a splint. Good thing you reacted so quickly. You did well, Grandma. Grandma. Constance froze. The doctor had called her Grandma. Not a neighbor, not just some lady, but Grandma. As if Jimmy were her grandson. As if they shared blood. You're a real hero, saving this boy from complications, the doctor continued, filling out the paperwork. Constance smiled. Warmth bloomed in her chest. Hero. Savior. The one without whom things would have been worse. When she brought Jimmy home, Dorothy wept with gratitude. Connie, what would I do without you? You're an angel. Angel. Constance memorized that word. That evening, alone in her house while Walter worked the night shift, she sat by the window and replayed the day over and over in her mind. The warmth of the child's body, the doctor's words, the mother's gratitude, the attention, the admiration, the love. She felt alive, truly alive, for the first time in years. And then a thought germinated in her mind. A terrible, wrong thought that she initially tried to dismiss. But the thought persisted. It whispered, if a child got sick again, they'd need saving again. And people would say thank you again, would call her a hero again, would need her again. Constance stood and walked to her medicine cabinet. Inside were various medications, aspirin, iodine, Walter's stomach remedies, and a bottle of paregoric, an opium-based medicine commonly used for everything from coughs to diarrhea. She picked up the bottle and held it up to the light. What would happen if she gave a child just a little, just a tiny bit, not to harm them, just to make them feel poorly? Not severely, not fatally, just enough to need help. Her help. Constance put the bottle back. No, this was insane. But the thought had already taken root. And 3 weeks later, when a neighbor asked her to watch little Patty, Constance added several drops of paregoric to the girl's lemonade. Patty became lethargic and complained of nausea. Constance called for an ambulance, wept over the girl, rode with her to the hospital. The doctors determined it was mild food poisoning. Patty recovered within 2 days, and the mother thanked Connie through tears. You reacted so fast! You saved my daughter! Constance smiled. The warmth in her chest burned hotter. She was needed. She was important. She was a hero. And it was better than any drug. Over the next 11 years, Constance Pruitt transformed child illness into an art form. She became the most sought-after babysitter in Locust Point. Mothers worshipped her. She charged minimal fees, a nickel a day, or nothing at all if a family was struggling with depression hardships. She watched children in the evenings, on weekends, during school breaks. She knew who to approach, who to select. She never touched the children of suspicious parents, doctors, police officers, only the children of ordinary laborers, busy mothers who didn't have time to ask questions. Children loved Mrs. Connie. She baked cookies, told stories, played hide and seek with them. She was kind, gentle, affectionate. And then, when the parents left, she opened her medicine cabinet. The arsenal grew over the years. She collected medications, digitalis that she claimed was for a heart condition she didn't have, phenobarbital prescribed for nerves, morphine sulfate she obtained through a corrupt pharmacist, ipecac syrup, castor oil, and various other substances. Small doses cause predictable effects: dizziness and weakness from cardiac medications, intestinal distress from laxatives, drowsiness and confusion from sedatives that doctors interpreted as infection symptoms. Constance was careful. She never gave too much. She calculated doses so the child would become ill but not die. She wanted to save them, not kill them. Murder didn't interest her. What she needed was gratitude and attention. But sometimes she miscalculated. Sometimes a child's system reacted unpredictably. In 1937, 5-year-old Martin Sullivan died from acute cardiac failure after Constance gave him too much digitalis. Doctors attributed the death to an undiagnosed congenital heart defect. Martin's mother sobbed at the funeral. Constance stood beside her, embracing her, weeping with her. Quote 10 she whispered. And the mother thanked her. Even in grief, thanked her. Quote 11 The death shook Constance, but not enough to stop. Instead, she became more careful with dosing. She kept detailed mental notes of what worked, what was too much, which children tolerated which substances. She was learning, refining her technique. In 1939, 7-year-old Harold Kovacs died after a severe reaction to a combination of medications Constance had administered. Again, doctors found no evidence of foul play. The boy had been sickly, they said. These things happen. By 1941, when America entered the war, Constance had perfected her system. With so many mothers working in factories for the war effort, her services were in higher demand than ever. The war years, 1941 through 1945, were her most active period. 13 children became seriously ill under her care during those 4 years. She varied her methods, varied the medications, always careful to avoid obvious patterns. Sometimes it was digestive issues, sometimes respiratory problems, sometimes mysterious fevers, always different enough that no one connected the dots. In 1943, 7-year-old Rebecca Brennan slipped into a coma after an overdose of phenobarbital. Constance had confused pediatric and adult dosing. The girl spent 3 weeks in intensive care. She survived but remained disabled, impaired coordination, speech difficulties. Constance was there throughout, weeping at the bedside, and the nurses called her a saint for her devotion. Each time a child was hospitalized, Constance visited. She brought small gifts, nothing expensive, she couldn't afford that on her limited budget, but tokens of affection. Used toys, fruit when she could get it past rationing, picture books. She sat by bedsides, read stories. She was the model of selflessness. Doctors and nurses melted at the sight. Now that's a real grandmother. Look how she loves these children. Walter died in early 1942 from a massive stroke, leaving Constance alone. His death should have devastated her, but truthfully, it freed her. No one questioned her activities now. No one asked where she was going or what she was doing. She was a poor widow, doing good works to fill her empty days. The community admired her even more. And no one asked the question, why do children in her care get sick more often than others? No one connected the dots. No one saw the pattern that stretched across 11 years and 19 victims. No one except Evelyn Hargrove. Evelyn Hargrove was 24 years old when she started her pediatric residency at Baltimore City Hospital in 1937. She was sharp, methodical, and possessed the kind of curiosity that made her an excellent diagnostician. By 1945, she'd seen enough unusual cases to develop what her colleagues called, quote, 13, an instinct for when something didn't add up. And in March 1945, that radar was screaming. It started with Tommy Whitaker, 3 years old, brought in unconscious by Mrs. Constance Pruitt. The boy had been in her care for the afternoon while his mother worked at a cannery. According to Constance, Tommy had been playing normally, then suddenly collapsed. By the time they reached the hospital, he was experiencing respiratory depression. Evelyn stabilized him, ran toxicology screens. The results showed traces of barbiturates in his system. When questioned, the mother insisted there were no medications of that kind in the house. "We don't have anything like that. I don't even know what barbiturates are," she said, bewildered. Evelyn documented the case and moved on. But something nagged at her. She couldn't articulate what. Then, 2 weeks later, another child came in with similar symptoms. 6-year-old Lucy Chen, also watched by Mrs. Pruitt. Respiratory distress, traces of cardiac medication in her blood. Parents didn't have cardiac medications. Mrs. Pruitt watches her sometimes, but Lucy was fine when I picked her up. Then an hour later she got sick, the mother explained. Evelyn began pulling charts. She requested records from other hospitals in Baltimore. And that's when the pattern emerged. 19 cases over 11 years. Different presentations, poisonings, mysterious seizures, unexplained allergic reactions, but one common thread. Constance Pruitt. She'd been present or had recently cared for the child in every single case. Evelyn brought her findings to her supervising physician, Dr. Harold Kessler, a 60-year-old department head who'd practiced medicine since before the Great War. She laid out the timeline, the commonalities, the statistical improbability of one woman being present for so many pediatric emergencies. Dr. Kessler listened, his expression growing more skeptical with each word. When Evelyn finished, he removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Dr. Kessler interrupted. Evelyn held her ground. Dr. Kessler stood, signaling the meeting was over. Evelyn left the office frustrated but not defeated. If the hospital wouldn't investigate, she would. Quietly, carefully, and she'd gather the concrete evidence Dr. Kessler demanded. The next 18 months were a careful dance. Evelyn couldn't openly question Constance Pruitt without alerting her, and she couldn't access certain records without proper authorization. So, she worked laterally. She befriended medical records clerks, bought them coffee with her limited budget, helped with their workload, and in return, gained access to archived files. She contacted other hospitals under the guise of a research project on pediatric toxic exposures in industrial cities. She interviewed parents, framing her questions as routine follow-ups on childhood illness patterns. The picture that emerged was chilling. Constance Pruitt had a specific pattern. She'd volunteer to watch a child, usually for several hours. The child would become ill, sometimes during her care, sometimes shortly after. The symptoms varied, but toxicology reports, when they were run, which wasn't always, showed traces of medications the families didn't possess. Constance was always first to respond, always called for help, always rode in the ambulance, always stayed at the hospital, and always the families praised her heroism. Evelyn tracked down 2 patterns that proved crucial. First, the severity of illnesses correlated with how recently Constance had experienced a personal setback or loss of attention. After her husband died in 1942, there was a spike in cases. 5 children became seriously ill in the following 6 months. After a neighbor hired a different babysitter in late 1944, 3 children in Constance's care fell severely ill within a month. Second, Constance avoided families with medical knowledge. No doctor's children, no nurse's children, no pharmacist's children ever appeared in her care records. But Evelyn still lacked the smoking gun. She needed to catch Constance in the act. In September 1946, opportunity presented itself. A new family, the Mitchells, moved into Locust Point. They had a 4-year-old daughter, Diane. Mrs. Mitchell worked at Bethlehem Steel and needed childcare. Constance offered her services. Evelyn heard about this through her network of parents she'd been quietly monitoring. She approached Mrs. Mitchell under a pretext, a public health survey on childhood nutrition in working families. During the conversation, she carefully steered toward childcare arrangements. When Mrs. Mitchell mentioned Constance, Evelyn's heart raced. "Mrs. Pruitt is wonderful," Mrs. Mitchell gushed. "She's watching Diane tomorrow afternoon." Evelyn made a decision that could have ended her career. She called in sick the next day and staked out Constance's house. She parked down the street with a clear view of the front door. At 2 p.m., Mrs. Mitchell dropped Diane off. Evelyn waited. At 3:30 p.m., Constance emerged carrying Diane. The child appeared limp. Constance rushed to a neighbor's phone, she didn't have her own, and called an ambulance. Evelyn drove directly to the hospital and was there when the ambulance arrived. She took charge of Diane's case personally. The girl was semi-conscious, experiencing bradycardia and respiratory depression. Evelyn ordered a full toxicology panel and had the lab rush it. Within 2 hours, results showed significant levels of digitalis, a cardiac medication. Evelyn questioned Mrs. Mitchell. "Does anyone in your household take heart medication?" "No, nobody." "What did Diane eat or drink at Mrs. Pruitt's house?" Connie said she gave her milk and cookies, homemade chocolate chip cookies. Evelyn's mind raced. She needed those cookies. __quote _30 __. Mrs. Mitchell looked confused but complied. 30 minutes later, she returned with a small bag of cookies. Evelyn sent them to the lab with an urgent note. __quote _31 ___. The results came back the next morning. The cookies contained digitalis, not a trace amount, a deliberate, significant quantity ground into the dough. Evelyn had her evidence. She brought the results to Dr. Kessler, along with her entire file of documented cases spanning 11 years. This time, he couldn't dismiss her. The evidence was incontrovertible. Dr. Kessler contacted the Baltimore Police Department. Detective Frank Brennan was assigned to the case. Detective Brennan was a 20-year veteran, a no-nonsense investigator who'd seen his share of human depravity. But even he was shocked by what Evelyn presented. Evelyn corrected. Brennan obtained a search warrant for Constance Pruitt's home. What they found in her medicine cabinet was damning. Digitalis, phenobarbital, morphine sulfate, ipecac syrup, castor oil, and various other medications, far more than any widow living alone would need. They also found a journal. The journal entries were chilling not because they confessed to crimes, but because they didn't recognize them as crimes. Instead, they read like the diary of a dedicated caregiver. Each entry documented a child's illness, Constance's heroic response, and the gratitude she received. Quote, 35, quote, 36, quote, 37. There was no acknowledgement that she'd caused these illnesses, or perhaps, Evelyn thought, Constance truly didn't see it that way. In her twisted psychology, the poisoning and the saving were separate acts. She needed the crisis to exist so she could be the hero. The causing of it was just preparation. Constance was arrested on October 3, 1946. The Baltimore Sun ran the headline, quote, 38, quote, the community reacted with shock and disbelief. Mothers who'd trusted Constance couldn't reconcile the kind woman who'd baked cookies with their children with the monster police described. It's impossible, Dorothy Doyle told reporters. Mrs. Pruitt loves children. She'd never hurt them. She saved my Jimmy when he broke his arm back in '34. But as more evidence emerged, the denials faded. Parents began remembering strange patterns, how their children always seemed to get sick only when with Mrs. Pruitt, how she was always the one who saved them, how she'd visit obsessively in the hospital, bringing gifts and attention. The trial began in March 1947. The prosecution, led by Assistant State's Attorney Philip Garrett, presented a damning case. Evelyn testified for 3 days, walking the jury through the medical evidence, the 11-year pattern of illnesses, the toxicology reports. Parents testified about their children's mysterious sicknesses. The journal entries were read aloud in court, their obliviousness to wrongdoing somehow making them more horrifying. The defense attorney, a public defender named Arthur Mills who'd been assigned the case, attempted to argue that Constance suffered from a mental condition that prevented her from understanding her actions. He brought in a psychiatrist who testified about hero syndrome and pathological need for attention stemming from childlessness and loss. But the journal entries undermined this defense. They showed calculation, selection of victims, awareness of cause and effect. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. They found Constance Pruitt guilty on 2 counts of second-degree murder, 4 counts of mayhem, causing permanent disability, and 13 counts of assault with intent to cause bodily harm. The judge, Raymond P. Alexander, sentenced her to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Before sentencing, Judge Alexander addressed Constance directly. "Mrs. Pruitt, you betrayed the most sacred trust a community can offer, the safety of its children. Over 11 years, you systematically harmed 19 innocent children to feed your own need for attention and gratitude. You disguised malevolence as charity, cruelty as kindness. 2 children are dead because of you. 4 more will carry disabilities for the rest of their lives. The harm you've caused extends beyond your direct victims. You've poisoned the well of trust that communities depend upon. Mothers will now fear every helping hand. Neighbors will doubt each other's motives. That erosion of social bonds may be your greatest crime of all." Constance showed no emotion during most of the sentencing, but at the very end, she spoke. "I loved those children," she said, her voice steady. "Everything I did was because I loved them. I saved them. I was there when they needed me. I was the one who cared." Evelyn, sitting in the gallery, felt cold. Constance genuinely believed that. In her fractured psychology, causing illness and then rushing to save the victim was an expression of love. She couldn't separate the harm from the heroism. She saw herself as the hero of every story, never the villain. Or perhaps she'd never tried to see it any other way. Constance Pruitt died in prison in 1959, 13 years into her sentence. She was 70 years old. A massive stroke killed her, not unlike the one that had killed her husband. Few people attended her funeral. She was buried in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery, a deliberate choice by the warden to prevent the site from becoming any kind of memorial or curiosity. But her case lived on. Evelyn Hargrove wrote extensively about what would later be termed Munchausen syndrome by proxy, after English pediatrician Roy Meadow identified and named similar patterns in the 1970s. Evelyn's documentation of the Pruitt case became foundational literature in pediatric forensic medicine. She gave lectures at Johns Hopkins, at medical conferences across the country, teaching doctors what to look for. The too attentive caregiver, the pattern of illness clustering around one person, the inexplicable medical events that defy diagnosis, the hero who's always present at the crisis. The children Constance harmed carried their damage forward. Tommy Whitaker survived but suffered developmental delays that affected him throughout his life. Rebecca Brennan never fully recovered her coordination and required assistance well into adulthood. Martin Sullivan and Harold Kovacs were dead, their potential extinguished by a woman who claimed to love them. But others survived intact, protected by Evelyn's intervention before Constance could do lasting harm. Diane Mitchell, the girl whose poisoned cookies broke the case, grew up healthy. She became a social worker specializing in child protection, dedicating her career to keeping children safe from hidden predators. Lucy Chen became a pediatric nurse. 6 others went on to normal lives, free from the trauma they were too young to remember, but which had nearly destroyed them. And Evelyn? She continued practicing pediatrics until her retirement in 1979, 42 years of service. She never married, never had children of her own. __quote_47__, she'd say when asked. All of them. Every single one. In 1978, a year before retirement, Evelyn gave an interview to the Journal of Pediatric Medicine. The interviewer asked how the Pruitt case had changed her approach to medicine. "It taught me that evil doesn't announce itself," Evelyn said. "It doesn't show up wearing a black hat and twirling a mustache. It shows up baking cookies and offering to help. It smiles, it comforts, it gains your trust, and then it destroys you while you're thanking it. The only defense against that kind of evil is vigilance, asking questions when everyone else accepts easy answers, believing the evidence even when it points to the unthinkable, being willing to stand alone if necessary." Do you think about her, Mrs. Pruitt? Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. "I think about the children, the 2 who died, wondering who they might have become. Martin might have been a father by now, a grandfather even. Harold had such energy. Who knows what he could have accomplished? The ones who survived with damage, I wonder what they might have achieved without those limitations. And the ones I saved, I hope they're living full lives, never knowing how close they came to being victims. As for Constance Pruitt, Evelyn shook her head. I try not to think about her at all. She wanted attention. She craved being remembered, being important. The best punishment I can give her memory is indifference. But that wasn't entirely true, and the interviewer knew it. Because Evelyn had ensured that Constance Pruitt would be remembered, not as the angel she pretended to be, but as the cautionary tale she actually was. Every medical student who read Evelyn's papers learned the name Constance Pruitt. Every doctor who attended Evelyn's lectures heard the story. The 11-year reign of terror. The monster who wore the mask of kindness. The killer who called it love. In 1995, 50 years after Evelyn first noticed the pattern, a journalist named Rachel Kovacs wrote a book about the case. Rachel was the niece of Harold Kovacs, one of the children who died under Constance's care in 1939. She'd grown up knowing the story, hearing her grandmother's grief at family gatherings, and as an adult, she'd decided to document it fully. The book, titled The Angel of Locust Point, 11 Years of Hidden Evil, became a bestseller. It examined not just Constance's crimes, but the systemic failures that allowed them to continue for so long. Why hadn't anyone noticed earlier? Why hadn't the medical community connected the dots sooner? Why had Evelyn's initial concerns been dismissed? What role did the Depression and war years play in creating an environment where a predator could operate undetected? Rachel interviewed survivors, now middle-aged adults. She interviewed the adult children and grandchildren of the two boys who died. She interviewed retired doctors and detectives who'd worked the case. And she interviewed Evelyn Hargrove, now 82 years old and living in a retirement community outside Baltimore. What would you say to young doctors today? Rachel asked. Evelyn's response was immediate. Quote 56, quote 57. Evelyn considered this carefully. Quote 58. The book reignited public interest in the case. A television documentary followed in 1997. Medical schools incorporated the Pruitt case into their curricula on medical ethics and forensic pediatrics. The term __quote_59__ entered common usage for healthcare providers who harm those in their care while pretending to help them. And slowly, other cases emerged. Cases that had been dismissed or misunderstood, now re-examined through the lens of what Evelyn had discovered. A nurse in Philadelphia who'd been present for 23 suspicious patient deaths over 8 years. A babysitter in Chicago whose charges consistently became ill with mysterious ailments. A nursing home aide in Seattle where elderly patients under her care experienced unexplained declines. The pattern was always similar. A caregiver who seemed devoted, who was always present during crises, who received praise for heroic responses to emergencies they themselves had created. Evelyn's work had created a framework for recognizing and stopping these predators. Countless children's lives were saved because doctors remembered the lesson of Constance Pruitt. Look beyond the surface, question the pattern, believe the evidence even when it damns the seemingly innocent. In 2002, Evelyn Hargrove died at age 89. Her obituary in the Baltimore Sun led with her work on the Pruitt case. Dr. Evelyn Hargrove, physician who exposed child poisoner, dies at 89. Hundreds attended her funeral, including many of the children she'd saved, now adults with children and grandchildren of their own. Diane Mitchell, 60 years old, gave the eulogy. Quote, 61, quote, she began, her voice steady but emotional. Diane paused, collecting herself. After the service, the survivors gathered, 11 of them, ages ranging from 56 to 68, the children who'd been harmed but had survived Constance's 11-year reign. They shared memories, not of Constance Pruitt, but of Evelyn Hargrove, the doctor who'd cared enough to look deeper, who'd risked her career to uncover an uncomfortable truth, who'd turned suspicion into evidence and evidence into justice. She never had children of her own, Lucy Chen said, now a 63-year-old retired nurse. But she mothered all of us. She protected us when we couldn't protect ourselves. More than that, Tommy Whitaker added, now 62 and working as a school administrator. She taught an entire generation of doctors how to protect children. How many lives has that saved? Thousands? Tens of thousands? We can't even count. Her impact ripples forward through time. They stood together in the cemetery, a small group of survivors bound by shared trauma they barely remembered, but which had nearly destroyed them. And they mourned the woman who'd given them their futures back. In 2015, on the 70th anniversary of Evelyn Hargrove's discovery of the pattern, Baltimore City Hospital dedicated a conference room in her name. The dedication plaque reads, Dr. Evelyn Hargrove, 1913 to 2002. Pediatrician, researcher, protector of children. Her vigilance, courage, and unwavering commitment to truth saved countless lives and changed the practice of medicine. Trust your instincts. Always look. May her example inspire all who enter here. Every year, the hospital hosts a symposium on child safety and medical ethics in that conference room. Medical students, residents, attending physicians, social workers, and child protection specialists gather to discuss cases, review research, and reinforce the lessons Evelyn taught. The case of Constance Pruitt is always discussed. Not to sensationalize, but to educate, to remind healthcare providers that monsters don't look like monsters. They look like kind neighbors, like helpful volunteers, like devoted caregivers. They smile and bake cookies and offer assistance. And the only way to stop them is to pay attention, ask questions, and trust the evidence even when it points somewhere you don't want to look. Diane Mitchell, now 73 and retired from social work, often speaks at the symposium. I don't remember being poisoned, she tells the audience each year. I don't remember Mrs. Pruitt or the hospital or any of it. I was too young. But I grew up knowing that someone had tried to hurt me and someone else had saved me. That knowledge shaped my entire life. It taught me that there are people who cause harm disguised as helpers and people who stop harm even at great personal cost. We all choose which one we're going to be. She always ends with the same message. Choose to be like Dr. Hargrove. Choose to look when it's easier to look away. Choose to question when it's easier to accept. Choose to act when it's easier to wait. Because somewhere, right now, a child needs someone to notice, someone to care enough to ask the uncomfortable questions, someone to be brave enough to uncover an ugly truth. Be that someone. One person's vigilance can save a life. Dr. Hargrove proved that. She saved mine. She saved 10 others in this room. She taught thousands of doctors to save thousands more. That's the power of choosing to see. The story of Constance Pruitt and Evelyn Hargrove is taught in medical schools across America. It appears in textbooks on pediatric forensics, medical ethics, and abnormal psychology. It's been the subject of countless articles, several books, and multiple documentaries. But beyond the academic study, it lives in practical application, in the thousands of doctors who've been trained to recognize the warning signs, in the protocols hospitals have implemented to catch similar cases early, in the lives saved because someone remembered to look beyond the obvious. In Locust Point, the neighborhood where it all happened, there's no memorial to Constance Pruitt. Her name has been deliberately forgotten, erased from the community memory as much as possible. But there is a small park, dedicated in 1998, named Hargrove Memorial Park. Children play there every day, running and laughing and living, unaware that they're playing on ground consecrated to the memory of a woman who dedicated her life to protecting children just like them. And perhaps that's the real ending to this story. Not the trial, not the prison sentence, not even the death of the villain or the hero. The real ending is in the children who play in Hargrove Memorial Park, whose parents watch them carefully, who go home safe at the end of the day. The real ending is in the medical residents who sit in Hargrove Conference Room and learn to ask the hard questions. The real ending is in the choice each person makes between being a Constance Pruitt or an Evelyn Hargrove, between seeking glory through others' suffering or seeking nothing but others' safety. Evil exists. It always has and always will. It disguises itself well, smiling and helpful and seemingly kind. But good exists too, vigilant and tireless and willing to stand alone if necessary. And when good refuses to close its eyes, refuses to accept easy answers, refuses to walk away when something feels wrong, that's when evil loses. Constance Pruitt wanted to be remembered as an angel. Instead, she's remembered as a cautionary tale, a monster who operated for 11 years before being stopped. Evelyn Hargrove wanted only to do her job well. Instead, she's remembered as a hero who changed medicine and saved countless lives. The distance between those two outcomes is vast, but the explanation is simple. One served herself, the other served others. One took, the other gave. One caused suffering to feed her own desperate need for validation. The other endured professional risk and personal sacrifice to end others' pain. That's the lesson. That's what endures. That's why, 80 years after Constance Pruitt first poisoned a child, we still tell this story. Not to horrify, though it does. Not to sensationalize, though it could, but to remind ourselves that every day we choose who we'll be. And that choice matters more than we can possibly know. Because somewhere, a child is depending on us to choose correctly, to notice, to care, to act. Choose well, choose bravely, choose like Evelyn Hargrove chose. And if you see something wrong, if your instincts scream that something doesn't add up, if a pattern emerges even when everyone else says you're imagining things, trust yourself. Look deeper. Ask questions. Investigate. Because the life you save might not thank you. They might not even remember you. They might be too young to form memories of their rescue. But they'll live. They'll grow. They'll have futures. They'll have children and grandchildren of their own. And that's enough. That's everything. That's the only reward real heroes need. The story ends here, but the lesson lives on. As long as there are people willing to see, willing to question, willing to stand up against comfortable lies in defense of uncomfortable truths, evil will not prevail. It will try. It always tries. But it will not win. Not while we remember Evelyn Hargrove. Not while we learn from Constance Pruitt. Not while we choose every single day to be protectors instead of predators, defenders instead of destroyers, light instead of darkness. The choice is ours. It always has been. It always will be. Choose wisely. Choose courageously. Choose to look when others look away. Choose to question when others accept. Choose to act when others wait. Because somewhere, right now, a child needs you to choose correctly. And 80 years from now, may someone tell the story of how you chose well.